Support for TC Jewfolk comes from the Ordway, presenting Fiddler on the Roof. This beloved theatrical masterpiece introduces a new generation to the powerful, heartwarming story of fathers and daughters and husbands and wives. In St. Paul, November 30th through December 12th, tickets are available at ordway.org. And TC Jewfolk is supported by Englander Dental and Dr. Manuel Englander. Located at 3801 West 50th Street in Edina, Dr. Englander and his caring professional dental team provide full-service dental care and transform smiles. Englander Dental specializes in everything from routine cleanings and teeth whitening to root canals, implants, and tooth replacement. For more information, go to englanderdental.com. Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week we have the audio version of the interview that Lev Gringauz, Jewfolk's editorial fellow and the host of the Jews Are Tired podcast, and I did with Robin Washington, Duluth resident and the Forward's editor-at-large, during Jewfolk's JCation fundraiser. We had a fascinating, wide-ranging conversation on journalism, justice, race, history, and more. So please listen in if you missed the video from last weekend on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Welcome to this year's State of the Jews interview as part of Jewfolk's JCation. I am Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk, and I am joined by TC Jewfolk editorial fellow and the host of the Jews Are Tired podcast, Lev Gringauz. Last year, we had a very cool opportunity to talk to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and this year we have an equally fantastic opportunity to talk to Robin Washington, who is the editor-at-large for The Forward. Robin was raised in Chicago by Black and Jewish civil rights activists, and in 1995, he was a co-founder of the Alliance for Black Jews. While advocating for Jews of color through his column at The Forward, Robin is also a host for Wisconsin Public Radio and a contributing reporter for Boston's GBH, their national public radio affiliate. Robin, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lonnie. Great to be here. Hello.
So we wanted to jump right in. You started as The Forward's editor-at-large in April of this year. So at a really interesting time in America. And over the course of the last 6 months, you've been there almost to the day as we're sitting here talking. You've done a lot of really interesting reporting in your column, including revisiting a lot of old events with a newer perspective. One of those columns was about Juneteenth, where you wrote about learning the truth behind the commonly repeated story that the holiday celebrates June 19th, 1865, when Union soldiers came to Galveston, Texas, to tell Black slaves they were free. What did you learn in the process of reporting out that column, and how did it affect your understanding of the holiday, the lessons there? And if there is one, how do we bridge truth and accepted narrative?
Well, that entire column was about learning. And one thing I've learned as a journalist, and I got to say, and not to put on airs, but not all journalists seem to learn this, okay? Which is to learn that you might be wrong and to correct yourself when you are wrong. And then to take it a bit further, I think a lot of journalists understand this part, is if you correct yourself, or you need to go back into something, advance the story. Don't just say, well, gee, I messed up. Or, I mean, you should say that, absolutely. Don't ever shy from that. But if there's a lesson that you can take in that and take it further and to explain why you got it wrong, and then what else everybody else is getting wrong, and what you do, what needs to be done right, or what is done right. In that case, I had written, actually, it is interesting because it is a learning process. I had written some years ago for Bacola Shown, piece on Juneteenth, and I've known about Juneteenth since whenever, so it was no big surprise to me. I'm not going to say finding it appalling, but shocking, except I have to realize this is the way I grew up. Okay, the things that people say we never learned about in school, I'm wondering, did they go to the same school or pay attention? Because I either learned about them in school, but more likely learn about them at home. But the point is, I can't remember not knowing what Juneteenth was. I may not have known it was actually June 19th. I think the first version of the story I heard was that it was June something, that the poor Black folk didn't know exactly what day it was, which actually, seriously, in the 19th century, that's a possibility. But in any case, so was June something, Juneteenth. And so I was asked by Bacola Schoen again several years ago to write about, Juneteenth from a Black Jewish point of view and make a comparison to Judaism, to liberation, to Passover, right? And that seems like an obvious thing, except it kind of bothered me. Juneteenth, we've had a celebration, by the way, up here in Duluth, which is where I am, which is where I live, from Chicago, Duluth, to Boston for 17 years, now back to Duluth for 17 years. And in Duluth, we've had a Juneteenth celebration for, I think, since I came back here in about 2004 or something. It's been a long time. We've covered it at the paper, formerly the editor of the Duluth. I don't remember not covering it. And so I certainly knew what it was about. But I always felt it was kind of bittersweet because, wait a minute. We're celebrating that the Union soldiers came and said, guess what? Not that you're free, but you've been free, and that you've been working. This is June 19th. So the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in January 1st, 1863. All right. Someone can check me in, I'm pretty sure it is. And granted, it only took effect in areas that were under control of the Union that were in rebellion. So if the Union soldiers came somewhere and it was a slave state, then at that point, Blacks were free in that area. Blacks who lived, by the way, in Kentucky and place. By the way, I'll go on a history lesson anytime you want to stop me. But if you were in Delaware, if you were in Maryland, if you were in Kentucky, did you know you weren't free? I'm not kidding. They were not free until late 1865 because these states were loyal to the Union, and the emancipation did not free them. It only freed those in areas of rebellion. So if you were in rebellion and they were in Texas, in Galveston, whatever, let's say the Union soldiers didn't even get there until June or something like that. Well, the surrender of Lee happened in April. So the war ended in April. And don't tell me people didn't know the war ended in April, okay? Even then, they had a telegraph. Word did travel. And so to say that the Union soldiers came and said, guess what, you're free, is so cynical, not of the Union soldiers, but of the Southern slaveholders, which meant that they had continued to enslave these people after every, any scintilla of doubt was gone, that the war was over. And that is horrible. Slavery is horrible in the first place, but it's beyond horrible that there's no legal justification for it whatsoever. So to celebrate it, yes, I'm celebrating the freedom, but I have a big difficulty saying that, coming with that is the realization that I've been slaving for absolutely nothing. Again, never to say it was okay in the first place, by no justification whatsoever, for at least 2 months, if not 2 years. Now, I wrote that column. I wrote it several years ago. We reprised it in a updated version for the forward. And right after doing so, I don't know if it's a friend of mine who posted it on Facebook or what, but I saw something on a historian friend of mine, Boston, and he said, once again, the canard of the slaves didn't know is being repeated. And I go, what? And I read what they're saying, and he's quoting another historian. And by the way, this guy's a friend of mine. He's actually a former state rep, Byron Rushing. We'll give him all the credit in the world in Boston. He's wonderful. He looks like Frederick Douglass, by the way. And he and I have longstanding arguments over whether or not Vermont or Massachusetts was the first state to outlaw slavery. And actually, Vermont, I did a show called Vermont, the whitest state in the Union for WGBH documentary. And that's what the Emmy is over there, by the way. And he is a Massachusetts historian. Of course, he's a historian in general. So he says Massachusetts ended slavery at a certain point, and Vermont, in his first item of his constitution, when it was an independent country, his first article says no person shall be held a slave in Vermont. So go figure. Okay. All right. Great. I'm way off on a tangent. The point was, I totally respect Byron Rushing, anything he had to say, and it got my attention. And so he quoted another historian who I called up immediately, and I will say on the spot here, I'm forgetting his name at the moment. Look it up. But indeed, no, it turns out that the enslaved people in Texas and everywhere else, excuse me for putting it this way, but there's no other way to put it, damn well knew they were free. Damn well knew who lost the war. And in fact, this thing was so horrible and cynical that people, that slaveholders in places like Tennessee, like Mississippi, like Georgia, were moving their slaves, their enslaved people, further west to get away from the advancing Union troops. So don't tell me they didn't know. And what the Union soldiers came to Galveston to do was enforce it, not to tell anybody. They didn't have to read it to tell it. Well, that's a totally different story, for which I feel better about Juneteenth, because it's an empowered story to say that the enslaved people were not stupid, which is unfortunately the narrative kind of says, I was quoting using vernacular that the original story, or the one that's out there, seems to be saying, "We free, boss." Well, no, they didn't have to ask. They knew. And the only way these Southern slaveholders were going to accede to it was at the point of a gun by the Union soldiers. So I rewrote that. It was a viral column. It was forward, but it went everywhere. And I don't think I'm done with it. That's another thing about my journalism, is it doesn't end. We haven't gotten there. Are we in the beloved community or no? So we got to keep going. I sent the note to friends of mine and at NPR and said, "Hey, you repeated this myth, which I just did a couple of weeks ago. Look, I'm right. I'm with you, but I'm correcting it. Okay, and here's the correction. I mean, you would not believe the response I got from everybody was, Robin, that is the most amazing thing. Thank you for setting it straight, and also for saying, I knew something was wrong with that." So seriously, amongst my many campaigns that I don't know when I have time to get to, but I will try at the end of the year to send something to the major networks, to NPR. NPR said, "We will look at it." They didn't respond to me. And I think it's important, because I know how media work. Do it at the end of the year, because they'll be doing the year in review pieces and saying, and also this year, Juneteenth was made a holiday. Juneteenth is the day that the slaves found out. No, don't repeat it. But the challenge will be next year to see what happens. Is it going to be said again? So I don't know where we go from there, but it tells you that, it's an ongoing struggle, even when you have a victory of sorts, even when, you do make a breakthrough. You can't let up, you can't assume it's all solved now. And I don't, look, I'm perfectly happy for somebody way bigger than me with a higher profile than me. In fact, I wish somebody would, can take it and disabuse all of us of that notion.
So in that same vein of sort of revisiting older events, with a new perspective, you also have a column about the 1991 Crown Heights riots, which is often talked about by Jews as a, no pun intended, black and white conflict where black residents were out for Jewish blood in Brooklyn.
A pogrom of blacks against Jews.
Right. So what did you find when looking at this event through a black Jewish lens? And is there anything in the process of rediscovering this story that Twin Cities Jews in particular should pay attention to?
So first of all, the person who brought it to my attention, and this is good, it speaks of the work that I'm doing at the Forward. It's not just writing columns. And in fact, that was a Q&A, and you guys know how this stuff works. So is a Q&A a column? I don't know, but it's got my byline on it. But the person who had the A's to my Q's is Akeda Ez, E-Z-E, and I apologize to her. I just started if I mispronounce her last name, Akeda Future is, and she is from a Black Orthodox family in Crown Heights. And the work I'm doing, again, is not just me writing columns, it is recruiting writers of color, it is recruiting employees of color. I think we have somebody else other than me pretty close to being on the staff. Great. It is looking at the coverage we're doing and saying, yeah, maybe we should have done it this way, or we should consider it this that way, or whatever. The language that we use. So it's everything that BEI is all about. And I give a lot of credit to the Forward for bringing anybody on, but me, to do that. But again, my soundbite for the last couple of years on things like this is, it's not an accident. The Forward did a lot of things that disenfranchise and disillusion or just pissed off, if you will, of Jews of color. And so, they needed to do something. There's really no excuse for having it all white Jewish staff. And we can get into Jews white and all that kind of stuff. If you want, we can take a long time on that one later. But Jews, I think one way of putting it is white appearing Jews. I've heard that one. So that's an interesting way of putting it. So
I feel like that's probably a whole different podcast or a whole different whole long video to dive into that question.
Except that I'll quickly say that we have a local connection with the Museum of Science, and I think many people will remember the Museum of Science's Race, Are We So Different exhibit, which went around the world. Came here to Duluth, but it started at the Museum of Science and again went around the world. It was co-sponsored by the American Anthropological Association, and it was totally definitively explaining to you with all kinds of exhibits and everything of race as a political construct, not a biological reality in any way, shape, or form. And part of that was the fluidity of race, how race changes over the years. And if you saw it, and if you didn't, you can look it up, it's still online. They will say how different groups were and were not white at periods. I would be colored, I'd be mulatto, I'd be, all kinds of different things depending what time period I was in. But, and so would you. And so were Jews considered white in the United States 100 years ago? Probably not. This would be interesting to all of us in Minnesota. Finns were decidedly not considered white. Particularly interesting up here in Duluth. Finns were considered Asiatic people, and I can tell you they weren't considered Asiatic people in a model minority sense. It's in an inferiority sense. And so we had, of course, you heard about the lynching of Clayton Jackson McGee in Duluth, the triple lynching of 3 African-American innocent circus workers for the totally fabricated alleged rape white woman. There was also a Finn who was tarred and feathered around the same time period. And it was not a good time. So, but make no mistake, they were not tarring and feathering, and he died, by the way. So he basically was lynched also. That was not a fellow white guy they were necessarily doing it to. So race changes over time and place. I've got other examples of that. Again, we'll come back to that one later. So part of, again, what I'm doing is the overall DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion of the Forward. And people who were not friendly to the Forward, Jews of color, who have been felt dissed by it in the past, saw some of the stuff I was writing. The Juneteenth column clearly got a lot of attention. And I remember one person who'd been a critic writing on one of the Facebook groups of Jews of color. Well, I guess I'll start reading the Forward again. And think about that. That wasn't actually about anything Jewish. I did make, you reminded me, Lonnie, that I made the allusion to Dachau about the slaveholders working their slaves It would be as if the Dachau people, after liberation, the Germans continued to work the inmates to death, whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
And by the way, anyone who, figures this kind of oppression, horrific human activity is worse than that, Camus calls it the calculus of blood. Okay, it's all unthinkable, horrendous, horrible. If you seriously ask me which I would rather be, it's a ridiculous question. But I will say, slaves as property were meant to be worked, but not die, as they were worth something to take the cotton as a machine. Jews as final solution fodder or whatever, the whole point was to kill them. However, to work them to death while you did so. Neither is the human condition you want to have anything to do with. So all that being the backstory, as I wrote about some of these things, some of those who've been disenchanted with the forward approached us and wanted to write, wanted to tell the story, and Akeda as was one of those. She grew up in Crown Heights in a Black Orthodox family at the time of the disturbance. Her family was there. They drove one of the white Jewish Hasidic families to the hospital and back in their Cadillac. Okay. And one of the things she pointed out, again, on the sensitive nature, was it a pogrom where people were attacked because they were Jews? She points out, or her contention, you don't have to agree with it, but this is her view, and she was there, was that people were being attacked because of their appearance, because they were part of the Jewish group that the Black group felt was responsible for the death of the young Black child when the Rebbe's motorcade went through the light. We can get into the details of the story, whatever. But she points out, as a highly practicing Orthodox Jew, Akeda points out they weren't being attacked for their Judaic practice. Think about it. Okay. They weren't being attacked as Christ killers. That doesn't mean, by the way, nobody didn't say that. Maybe somebody did. And I'm sure they said kill the Jew. And it was a horrible thing. And by the way, there were attacks going the other way too, which is something else she talks about. And the whole history of the relationships between Blacks and Jews in the area, and the relationship of Orthodox Jewish children like her. That what she had to put up in schools was unthinkable. That doesn't justify the violence that later happened, but it's a broader picture. You would not believe the response I got from, and I'm going to actually call it this, the Black Jewish community. Now, there's a timeout here. The Black Jewish community is like the Jewish community. There ain't no such thing. It's way more than one community. There's Black Orthodox, there's this type of Black Orthodox, that type. There's Reform, Conservative. Of course, my favorite adage: you put two Jews on a desert island, you get three congregations, right? And one of which is the synagogue I wouldn't go into that I started myself, right? But so Black Jews, let alone all Jews of color, are incredibly diverse amongst themselves. But I'm going to tell you, of all the stuff we published, or that I have ever published, I never got such universal, I don't want to call it praise because it's horrible stuff we're talking about, but universal commendation for running that. And again, there was one single word that somebody posted. Somebody else who was from a Black Orthodox family, who doesn't necessarily like this Black Orthodox family, and who posted, finally. Because this side of the story, for whatever reason, for 30 years, and that's why we did it, was the 30th anniversary,
right,
had never been told. Nobody went to this family and asked them. And that's ridiculous.
So that's something I actually wanted to drill down onto a little bit. The title of that column, The Missing Voices of Black Jews in the Crown Heights Tragedy, just to put a little finer point on it, and I think you started talking about it there, but what do you think we're missing? when we look at mainstream Jewish narratives without Black Jews and Jews of color?
Well, it's in that case, it wasn't just a Jewish narrative because it was New York Times, was every other
Sure.
publication that
Sure,
talked
sure.
about it. But you're missing the fuller picture. It's like diversity 101. The example I throw out way too many times, but is once I remember the Chicago Tribune. I don't know, column or what. It was first person, so I guess it was. I remember it saying something, and this is years and years ago, but it doesn't matter. Something saying, somebody writing something that said, when we see a Black youth on the L with a boombox, so this was 80s, we are afraid. Well, time out. The person reading the column, who's your we? That might be the Black youth on the bus or on the L with the boombox, right? I don't think he's afraid of himself, And so immediately that tells you a lack of respect for your audience, and to realize that who are you speaking to in the first place? And it doesn't take the Chicago Tribune circa 1980 to do that. Or a better example is, and as I tell things in stories, is if you want a complete picture, you've got to represent different points of view. Now, every journalist is supposed to know that. Every journalist is supposed to know if you interview somebody on side A, you go look for side B, right? And there's always another side, even if it's what I always call the tiddlywinks parade, it's totally innocuous, doesn't offend anybody. I'm sure there's an anti-tiddlywinks group. Okay. So, but one of the best examples is also, I think around the 80s and 90s, Al Newhart, when he was the president of Gannett, and he was what we now would call woke, mind you, middle-aged, late middle-aged, white man, successful, rich guy. But for whatever reason, truly embraced the idea of diversity, so much so that he ordered. He didn't ask. He didn't make it, optional. He ordered. He was the president of Gannett. All his reporting staffs to do what he called mainstream. And that meant on every, let's just say, major story, it couldn't have been every story, to include voices at the time called minority voices, or voices of color. Okay? To have one source be of color to get the view of that community. And he got a lot of pushback for it, but on the other hand, he was the boss. He told them to do it, and they did it. So I never worked for a Gannett paper. I worked for the Boston Herald. Very fun job at that time. A, it was a newspaper, and B, it was a scrappy tabloid taking on an occasionally worthy opponent in the Boston Globe, and with a fewer resources and crazier conditions and all. And so I decided, though, I was going to mainstream my own coverage. I had a transportation column, and there was a story about something we don't have in Minnesota. I thought about advocating for it here, and I know not to do it. In Massachusetts, there are vehicle inspections. Every 2 years, you have to have your car inspected for emissions. And seriously, I thought about advocating for that in Minnesota, and I realized that 90% of the cars in northern Minnesota would be off the road, and people would not really want me to do that. So we didn't. But so what happened was somebody changed the inspection standards, and they were going to be tougher. Well, that sounds like a good idea, except one thing: more people would fail, and if they failed, it was going to cost money to fix your car. And if you didn't fix the car, you couldn't get to work. We know about all those kind of things these days. And so I went out to a gas station. I strongly believed, and part of my column was to get regular, everyday people. Not all journalists do that too. So I think that that's very important, because it's great, to get the experts and all, but what does the regular person on the street think about it? So I went to a gas station, and I interviewed 5 people. And at that gas station, it was actually an area that was fairly multicultural. and but they were all white people who showed up at the time that I was there. I worked Sunday through Thursday, and so this was Sunday evening, approaching 6 o'clock. Back in the days when we could file at 6:30 or something for the next day's paper. We didn't have to file it for 2 seconds later for a tweet. That's where we are now. So my deadline was 6 o'clock, and there I am at 5:45, and then it's 5:50 and 5:55, and there are no people of color showing up at this gas station. And I'm thinking, go to another station, and well, this one usually has people who talk and whatever, and and also a little journalism lesson. It has to that actually was a good station because of where I could stand and not look like I was a crazy person or a panhandler or whatever. I'm serious. These are things to take into consideration.
Absolutely.
And it affects getting the truth of the story, because if a person thinks you are a panhandler or you're trying to do something to them, they're not going to answer the question at all, or if they do, it might be with more hesitation. So if I did a story about the T, the Boston Transit System, I stood on the platform of the T. If I did something about a supermarket, I stood by. Now, mind you, the same people who are on the T shop at supermarkets, but I don't ask a question about the supermarket on the T.
Yeah.
You have to have the context. So in any case, I'm waiting there, and there's no people. And I said to myself, 5 more minutes, 6 o'clock comes and goes. Okay, I'm getting late. Well, 6:05 comes and goes, 6:10. Finally, at 6:15, a black man pulls up, and I interview him. And he says, man, my car is going to fail, and I ain't got no money to fix it. I'm not going to be able to get to work. This thing is going to hurt. All the white people have said, yeah, it's tough and all, but yeah, I'll deal with it. A totally different story. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean the story is all one way or the other, and it's not scientific. If I had 4 of one and one, but it shows a different side. Whereas if he hadn't shown up or I hadn't waited for him, then I would have had 4 all saying, yeah, it's tough, but we'll. So that applies. There's your Crown Heights story. That doesn't mean that Akeda's story is the final version. There was a whole governor's report on Crown Heights and everything. I'm sure they talked to everybody and all kinds of stuff. But this is a part that had not been included in the national discourse. Now it is. And I'm telling you, the word finally really describes, as far as I could see, universally, the Black Jewish community's response.
So let's then take all of that and hit the present day and revisit the murder of George Floyd, another subject you've covered both in your column as well as for Wisconsin Public Radio. It's been 1.5 years since now former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin pinned Floyd under his knee for 9 minutes until he died. The aftermath of widespread protests against police brutality and racism also meant among American Jews some introspection on racism in our communities and organizations, and a lot of chest beating about how we were going to do better and fix the problem and be more welcoming to Jews of color. So in your perspective, how is the Jewish community doing locally and nationally on facing racism head on and holding ourselves accountable to all the words said after George Floyd's murder?
So I need to, again, dissect that into several different groups: the Jewish community, the white appearing Jewish community, the Jewish community of color, and the larger American community of all of us in the white American community. One response you got from the larger communities and the let's say institutional Jewish community, certainly the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations in the United States, was we can do better. Actually, my dear Wisconsin Public Radio said we can do better. We must do better. And since then, I'm sort of jumping to the end of this story, but doing better, unfortunately for Wisconsin Public Radio, meant only hiring one person of color since that time. And believe me, I put in a lot of efforts to help do that. And we're having strong conversations about us getting it right, which we haven't done so far. Or at least the network has not done. I love biting the hand. By the way, I do that all day long. So, but I'm serious when there are challenges that have not been met. Wisconsin Public Radio is by no means alone. Any number of organizations have made lip service, have made pronouncements. That, by the way, was a public statement by Wisconsin Public Radio. That wasn't in the internal memo. It was, we must do better, and said to specifically, I'm one of two hosts of color in the entire network, and I host a regional show in Superior. Okay, I mean, granted, it goes big chunk of the state in Minnesota too, but the point is, we're talking about an entire state radio network. I'm one of two hosts of color. Yes, we can and we must do better. We haven't. So again, Wisconsin Public Radio is not alone. Hey, my friends at Minnesota Public Radio had the highest profile Black classical host, right? Garrett and the Queen, and fired him. And supposedly because he wasn't keeping music logs right, or he was changing his music at the last minute. I could tell you any number of radio stations that don't keep music logs. Now, I know Minnesota Public Radio has a higher standard, but come on. This guy had a distinctive Black voice of bringing Black classical music to not just the network, but all who they syndicated to. And he was fired. I'm just going to leave that right there, as they say. So, and my dear friend Dushan Drew is African-American. He's now the president of NPR. I hope at some point we do better about that. So, so there was any number of people. I haven't got any Jewish organizations, and I did, not for the Forward, but for a small Jewish newspaper in Massachusetts, Jewish Journal, in collaboration with Bacola Schoen. And my assistant and I did a whole analysis. We went through every board member of all the Council of Presidents groups. So there are 50 odd groups to the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. Combined, they have about 2,000 board members. We looked at all the board pictures. We looked at family backgrounds of each. We looked at, if we couldn't find that, I use all my reporting investigative skills, let's put it that way. And we killed ourselves to do this, to come up with the racial breakdown of the membership, board memberships of the Council of Presidents organizations. 0.2% were Black, which, okay, that's completely unacceptable. There is no way by any estimate of the Black Jewish population that comes out that low. 2% were of color. I no estimate is the of color population of Judaism that low. And that's only because the American Mizrahi Association had a huge number, and that's only Mizrahis that in a broad sense might be considered of color. Not all of them consider themselves of color. I said we looked at pictures. I told you, a little while ago that race is a political construct. I can't tell by looking at you guys what you are, right? You could be Black, you could be, Hispanic is a fluid thing. In some countries, it's a race, La Raza. In the United States, it's not a race. We have census, data that says white Hispanic, Black Hispanic. People were scratching their heads, what? I thought that was, but you ask people on the street, hey, what's this Hispanic guy? Oh, well, it's not white, right? And so, I mean, given all my years and years and years of living the racial reality, that's how we determine from as much as we could, without being the persons themselves, what the racial identity of these board members were. For instance, there was a woman named Chang, C-H-A-N-G. Nope, she was married to a Chinese American. He was not Chinese American. I don't get it for that. On the other hand, again, we had latitude about Mizrahi. And we had at the end of the study, we had a whole methodology that explained that race is a political construct, that it changes from place. I've been avoiding saying the stories. I'm going to say it very quickly. One of the people we found on an organization, forget the organization, but in any case, he lived in California, and his background was, I believe he was Ukrainian, but before the World War II, his family escaped and they went to Central America. That's where he was born. He was given a Hispanic name because that's what you do when you move to a country and everybody is named Mario or Luis or something like that. Then they moved to the United States. So what is he? He's Hispanic. Well, genetically, he's Ukrainian, right? And my favorite of all, we had this in the forward, right, was a piece about Don Francisco. Do you know about Don Francisco? He was, the title of the piece, we were going through some headlines today, actually, in a meeting, and it said, why retire? It said, catching up with the most watched Jew in television history. And that's Don Francisco. Who the hell is Don Francisco? Okay, the program was on Univision. It's called Sábado Gigante. It ran for 50 years. It went off in 2017. The host is Don Francisco. If you Google him and you see, and if anyone looks Hispanic, whatever that means, he is the archetype or prototype of a Hispanic, you know, not the dashing type, but more the lovable grandfather type. Right? And always very affable. It is no question Don Francisco is Hispanic, except he's German Jewish. His real name is Mario Kreuzenberg. And his family escaped Nazi Germany in 1938 and went to Chile. That's where he was born. Hence, once again, his name was Mario, right? And then he learned about television. He went to the United States, and he, before television really hit Chile, and he said, hey, I want to do this TV thing. He started the show. It got to be popular. Univision was invented. He ends up bringing it to Miami. Now he's Hispanic. So what did I say? Race changes depending on where you are and when you are. In 1900 in Germany, they may have been white, like Kreuzenberg. In 1938, they certainly weren't white anymore. In 1938-9, in Chile, they were white again. And in 1985, in Miami, he wasn't white anymore. Same family. That's what race is about. And we put that in the study. And so, so the study, though, beyond, I just want to say that because the methodology is huge. Boston Globe, my dear friends, and I've since been on the editorial board of the Boston Globe. Their spotlight team of church abuse fame was on the Herald church abuse team, taking them on head for head. We didn't have any movies made about us, but although it was seriously the most serious story I ever worked on in my life, and that's another show. Very, but in any case, the Boston Globe Spotlight team has also done these diversity studies, but I'd have to say they didn't look at it with the nuance that my assistant in years of doing this. So with those really horrendous numbers, that's the challenge of those boards to diversify themselves. To the credit of Jewish organizations, there have been a lot of hires. Interestingly, more in staffers than board members. And the irony is in my column that accompanied that piece or the study, I pointed out that board members are the low-hanging fruit. Anybody can get you on a board. If you don't, you hear people say, oh, well, our cycle isn't around yet. Change your bylaws. That's a vote. It's easy enough, you know? you can make the cycle happen tomorrow, right? What are the qualifications of a board member? Whatever it is you want. Someone said, well, you know, they want people well-heeled. That guy, I said it was like Mario Kreuzenberg, the guy who's in LA, whose family was from Ukraine. He's a billionaire, okay? There are Jews of color who are billionaires. Not here, but I mean, there are, okay? And so, and you don't just need billionaires on your board, you need people from various different fields. So that's still work that needs to be done. But I will say a lot is, not a lot, but a number of staffers of Jewish organizations of color now have been hired, or another number of staffers of color have been hired in Jewish.
So, lest people who are watching this think that this is a new thing that you've been studying, this, right? I mean, you've been talking and been very vocal about the lack of Black Jews and Jews of color in Jewish leadership positions since at least 1995, when you co-founded the Alliance for Black Jews. Is it frustrating 26 years later to be seeing the same thing to the same degree?
Well, I wouldn't say it's to the same degree. And I would say there has been a ton of progress. And maybe it doesn't, sort of like the civil rights movement, that people say, well, how much did we really get or whatever? Well, you weren't around. Okay, I was a young child taking a protest when I was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old by my mother, who was an officer of Chicago Corps, Congress of Racial Equality, and the NAACP. And yes, I will easily tell you that things were better. We were in Chicago, we were in the North, but things were way different and way better. Look, when I was in high school, I got my yearbooks over there. We had some online reunions or whatever recently. If you really want, I could open up to a page and show you the N-word in my yearbook by a supposed friend classmate. Okay, that's 1975. So don't tell me the world hasn't changed. And I wrote something nasty in his book too. I didn't use racial slurs, but don't tell me it didn't happen, and don't tell me there's no difference. So we have made a lot of progress. And we certainly have made progress. And the mere idea that I cannot imagine, even in your most insulated Satmar community, perhaps, anyone who doesn't have the concept of a Black Jew, let alone a Jew of color. My dear friend, Rabbi Mendy Ross here in Duluth, is a Chabad rabbi. And he's, I like to say, light-skinned it. The official Black way is saying skinned it, by the way, it's not skinned. And he is, a white-appearing Jew. Well, he's actually got Hispanic background from the very same way that I just told you about Mario Kreuzenberg, that his grandmother's family, he just told me the story the other day in his sukkah, and that his grandmother's family, his grandmother was raised in Cuba, and she's Cuban for all practical. Everything about her is Cuban. And that's his, I'm not sure if his mother's mother or which side, I'm pretty sure it is. And the bottom line is, so is his mother Cuban? Then he says, am I Hispanic? And he says, well, I certainly don't go checking boxes for that, because he grew up in New Jersey in a Chabad, community. On the other hand, he says, I'm not going to say I'm white. And that goes back to the whole thing of Jews not identifying as white, which again is a whole different animal. But in his case, though, I think it's partially, if I can put him on the couch here, I'm sure you won't mind, that it's doubly informed by his own family's reality that race was a part of it. And I think is, by the way, I've said this several times, it's the best story out there. What else can you report on that constantly changes in front of you, that doesn't exist, and yet it occupies so much of our existence, right? There is no such thing as race. Nothing illustrated. By the way, the Mario Kreuzenberg story has a third manifestation in a column I've got to get done this week. My own family. My forebears, my mother's Jewish and not African American. My father's African American Jewish. My mother's family is German Jewish. They found out later on, not as much as they thought. And our forebear comes from Germany to the United States in 1860. We know it's Birkenstein, by the way. And if you meet a Birkenstein, that is a relative of mine. Well, we didn't know about the Birkensteins that were our forebears' brothers line that stayed in Germany. And they ended up as those that did escape, and in fact, some didn't, and we didn't know that we lost people in the Holocaust, which changes your reality because no matter what you say, Jews who feel they didn't lose anyone in the Holocaust, I'm never going to tell you this, but there's a degree of superiority. We knew a lot. We were smart. We got out. How in the world my great-great-grandfather would have known in 1860 it was time to leave Germany? I don't think so. But let's, well, it turns out we were wrong because, again, his brother's family, his brother's descendants were there. We did lose people. But one part of the family, believe it or not, one of them was actually released from a concentration camp in 1938, immediately got out, could not come to the United States, came to Colombia, raised his family there, and my cousin Arnold was born in Colombia. Once again, Mario Kreuzenberg. So, it's a fascinating story, and it's in my own family. I know, you almost look speechless after that. Where do you go from there, right?
You are, if I can say it, you are like the perfect combination of my favorite history and journalism professors. So when it comes to the Beyond the Count study that came out recently, I believe in early August, talking about sort of going behind the numbers of how many Jews of color do we have in the United States, but really, who are Jews of color? What do they think of themselves and of their Judaism? You covered the study on your forward column with just one piece, which sort of surprised me a little bit, because you sort of largely just laid out the results of the study itself. I'm curious to poke you a little bit more about your thoughts on the study. With the benefit of a little bit of time and introspection, how do you think the results have aged?
Well, I think it goes back to Lonnie's question about how far we've come, and I've been saying this stuff for so long. So there was, without again being supercilious with Mud, there was not much in the study that surprised me or shocked me. There was nothing in this study that shocked me. There are very few feelings in there that I haven't been aware of for some time. I will say there are younger Jews of color who express much more, I don't even want, because it's the political side of me that doesn't want to give diplomatic recognition to it, but I don't want to talk about rejection because I'm going to quote Julius Lester here when he talked about his conversion. This was to me 30 years ago when his conversion was a new thing and he was speaking to a Black Jew for the first time in his life on purpose. That he, I asked him about acceptance and he expressed some irritation and he said, I had to convert whether or not any white Jew ever accepted me. It had to be so important to me that I would do it. No Jew accepted me. And that, frankly, is what conversion is supposed to be all about in the first place, let alone anything to do with of color. All that being said, again, my entire life has been working of myself being normal and normalized, working toward normalization and the recognition that normalization is the de facto state of Jews of color. When I say I grew up, and I mentioned to you guys, my three guiding guideposts are journalism, Judaism, and justice, and how they intersect each other. So the justice part of the civil rights movement that I grew up in, again, our family was in the Congress of Racial Equality, the name, and I later met the founders of the Congress of Racial Equality, George Hauser and Jim Farmer, and I got to be very, very good friends with them until their deaths. And one thing they told me was that the naming of the Congress of Racial Equality was, the initial name was the Committee for Racial Equality. But after a lot of meetings in Chicago in 1942, where they started, I said, well, why are we the Committee for Racial Equality? Racial equality exists. It always has. Racial inequality is a human, monkey wrench thrown into the thing. Races are equal. So we are the Congress of Racial Equality. And that is what I grew up with. although it was articulated to me later on when I again got to meet the founders of the organization. And so Jews of color being part of normalized Judaism. What you guys said earlier about, what do you say to the Jewish audience about, well, the Jewish audience includes Jews of color, right? That has been what my work and life being is all about. I am a bit distressed. This comes out in the study, but I saw it before the study came out, that the younger generation, of whom there are many more. I mean, the beauty is there's all these Black Jews around I don't know. And I used to know everybody. You know? And so these younger people are out, let alone other Jews of color. But the problem is they are expressing, rejection or hostility, out and out hostility, or everything. The study said that in Jewish spaces, that should have been solved by now. That, now my daughter, already middle-aged, decided so, she's empowered and sort of raised under that normalization. But for whatever reason, it hasn't spread to the next generation, or half generation or something like that. So that is distressing in the study. Now, at the same time, it's also, we're empowered, particularly post George Floyd, to say enough is enough. There is no reason for anyone in any shul to come up to you and say, "Are you Jewish?" If you're in the shul, first of all, you're in a shul. So if you're in a church, mosque, shul, whatever, you're there as a worshiper. Granted, at my lovely Temple Israel in Duluth a few years back, we had some Messianic Jews show up. All right. Okay. We didn't tell them to leave or anything like that until they showed up on the high holidays. And then we said, okay, you know what, we're open, but this is not the time. You wanted to observe us, whatever, that's fine, but this is not the right time. We don't do the tickets, by the way, but we put it on at a membership as part of when they were not members. So they went away. But other than, and they were certainly not Black Messianic Jews, by the way. Although actually there was one who came to our shul once. But even her, and this is the nuance that I guess is another hallmark in my work, the Black Messianic Jew who showed up at Temple Israel is a friend of mine. She actually is from Ethiopia, and she, I believe, was an Ethiopian Christian, and then sort of gravitated toward Messianic Judaism. Do you see a journey happening here? So, that may be, and the only reason I looked at it that way was from my coverage of the church, the Catholic Church sex abuse crises. I covered the victims probably closer than anyone, very much more than the Boston Globe. I'm not kidding. I got to know the victims groups quite well. And by the way, that came from my movement background and my protest background. They didn't seem like odd people standing in front of the cathedral with signs, because my family stood outside with signs, 30, 40 years before. So, obviously, if you've been sexually abused by a priest, Catholicism is not exactly your religion of choice at that point, okay? Or it usually will have some kind of effect on you. And one of the victims actually became a Messianic Jew or Christian, whatever you want to call it, Messianic. Well, actually, that changed my view, because I said, you know what? He's on a journey. He's clearly going away from Catholicism. I'm not proselytizing. I don't do that. And I'm not saying, we can't wait for him to become Jewish. But he's going somewhere. So, and he clearly isn't the same type of person who would come in synagogue, whatever, and try to proselytize. All that was an aside. I'm saying that the whole thing of asking people why they're in a synagogue is ridiculous. Do that. You respect people. You certainly don't do it for people of a different color. And somebody's sitting there with the talit on and they're davening, they're holding the prayer book. And that doesn't mean you say, oh, you read Hebrew very well either. You don't say anything to them that you wouldn't say to any other congregant. Best thing to say is Shabbat Shalom.
Well, on that note, Robin Washington, we really deeply appreciate all of the time that you've had for us, not just for this year's JCation in this conversation here, but the past interviews and panels you've been on in the past with TC Jewfolk. We really appreciate it. I know as somebody who enjoys history, I got a ton out of learning about this, and as a journalist really enjoyed, and I know I'm sure Lev did as well, I feel comfortable speaking for him here, really enjoyed the way that you look at these really, really big, weighty, important topics. You're not afraid to say, oh, maybe I got this wrong, but also to keep going back and digging in on these pieces, because it's important to make sure that the record doesn't just stay static. When it needs to be updated, it needs to be updated. And the more we learn, the better we can be. And I think that right there is a pretty good metaphor for us as people, not just,
right.
As Jews, as human beings, when we know better, we can do better.
Right. And as journalists, by the way, you've heard, the old adage that journalism is the first rough draft of history. Well, the problem is, and that goes directly to the Crown Heights. That was a rough draft that we kept the rough draft, and we didn't go back and look into it and say, well, wait a minute, what else happened? What were the other points of views? And so now I hope that rough draft has been refined a little bit.
Well, I hope so too. And Robin, thank you again for joining us. We really, we appreciate your expertise and your wisdom, and just thank you for being here today.
Always a pleasure.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network, a product of Jewfolk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.